the best, everyone.
Thank you.
There we go, that's people coming in. Welcome, everyone, as you join us. If you've joined us before, you'll be used to my introductory vamping while you all enter this digital space. So I just wanted to say hi. So my name's Alan. I'm the registration manager at the Fringe, slash kind of Zoom MC for the past 3 weeks. And I'm just here to do a welcome to the Fringe Society and also just give you some brief housekeeping, I guess, on how today's going to work. So first of all, this is a Zoom webinar in case you haven't been in one before. Essentially what that means is you come in with your video off and your microphone muted. So please don't worry, it's not a technical issue or anything that you have to worry about. That's just helps us in our presentation of the event. That doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you though. Please do in the chat function, which you can find on the bottom of your screen, just to the left of center. It'd be great if you could say hello, where you're joining us from. It just helps know that we're not just speaking into a Zoom void and that the Fringe community is there, alive and well for us to engage with. You'll also see we've got a Q&A function, which is just off towards the right-hand side of center. And we'd really love when we open it out to a Q&A, we'd really love it if everyone could pop their questions in there, but I'll also keep an eye on the chat just in case things get lost. Finally, this session is BSL interpreted today. For those who want to use that service to access it, the lovely Greg is currently signing alongside us on the screen, but he will be working alongside David, who you'll see them swap in and out every 15 minutes. As an attendee in a webinar, you don't have quite the same control over your view. So if you're ever finding that the screen's too small or it's a bit of a strain, if you direct message me in the chat, so you can find me under Fringe Society Alan Gordon, I can promote you to a panelist and give you better access to your screen. Don't worry, you'll still be invisible, so you can watch from the wings with more control over your view. But that's more than enough from me. So I'd love to pass over to today's wonderful chair. So Paulette, over to you.
Thank you, Alan. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today we are going to be looking at programming with diversity in mind. We're really privileged that we've got 3 fantastic panelists for you. We've got Skinder Hundal, Stella Kanu, and Sharon Watson. What I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of context of what we're going to be looking at and just tell you a wee bit about myself. I run a small arts organisation in the Midlands called Serendipity. One of the things that we do is we ensure that diversity is at the forefront of everything that we do. We have an annual dance festival called Let's Dance International Frontiers, and we also host Black History Month. We have an archive, and we publish on Black arts and culture. So what I'm going to do is realistically what we're going to look at programming. How do we move cultural diversity work from the margins to the centre? We're going to look at sustainability, funding and building programmes year on year. We're going to look at nurturing artists, what platforms are available to develop and showcase new work. We're going to look at partnerships, brokering real relationships with individuals and organisations that make up a community. That's artists, venues, education, community groups, probation service, the national health. We're going to look at environments. We're going to look at the issue about knowing your city, understanding the complexities of it, the visibility and the invisible dynamics at play, at reaching out to interest groups and the needs and the partnerships. And we're going to look at legacy. And all of these elements are part of programming with diversity in mind. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with Skinder Hundal, who is going to give you 5 minutes about himself and the work that he's doing. And then we're going to pass on to Sharon Watson, and she will again talk about the organisations that she's worked for and what the work that she's doing. And then we'll pass on to Stella. And at the end of the talk, we're going to have a conversation. because the whole point about today is about having a conversation. And we're going to have a conversation where we'll touch upon all the points that I've mentioned a minute ago, from programming, sustainability, to nurturing, to partnership, environment, you know, legacy. We're going to touch on all of that within the conversation. So what I'd like you guys to do in the interim is to get your questions ready. So at the end of that session, there's an opportunity to send questions to the panel. And so without further ado, over to Skinder. Skinder, hello.
Hi, and thanks, Paulette, and thanks to the Fringe for inviting me to be part of this illustrious panel to talk about a subject which is very close to my heart. So in 1992, I went up a hill, down a hill, finished university, entered an art centre, and it was called Nottingham Art Exchange in those days, and they were running a festival called Nottingham Mela. It was the first Mela in Britain in 1988 when it launched, and it was the pioneer for Melas across the country. So I started after completing my manufacturing and industrial management course, and thinking, industry, the smell of oil, grease wasn't quite me. And when I connected with this art centre, things started to open out in a much bigger way. Beyond the experience of being a student and leaving home and going through adolescence in a sense, as you graduate and being a student and finding independence. But this space was a place where one could express, one could learn about one's identity, culture, heritage, but also sense of contemporary place and sense of contemporary identity as we were finding a new confidence. And in that new confidence of a second generation of immigrant communities, we were beginning to show and share something special that was forming. And that was this third space of invention between what we had inherited and what we had learned growing up in Britain. And remember, during the 70s, 80s and 90s, particularly the 70s and 80s, it was very difficult for South Asian, African, Caribbean and people of colour. It hasn't got easier. It has changed, but the issues around racism still exist. What's interesting, though, is at the time, Up in Our Arts were the organisation who ran the Mela, and there's another organisation called IMACA, which was East Midlands African Caribbean Development Agency, looking at visual art. So the two came together in 2003 to form New Art Exchange and to create a flagship venue, which then launched in 2008. I left Nottingham in '94 as the volunteer of the old centre to return in 2008 as the director. And this was a very exciting opportunity. It felt for me like I was coming home to a place that had given birth to my thinking and sense of self, in a sense, that went beyond what one would experience at home or at school or at university. And so this was more than a job. It was me paying homage to a very important space in a neighbourhood called Hyson Green. And Hyson Green was known for all the wrong reasons, and sadly it still is, but with the venue, things have shifted, and we do bring in a new footfall into the neighbourhood, which is full of traders who have no shutter down. So everybody survives. I'm not sure about thrives, but at least there's survival there. And that's what you're up against in a city neighborhood. So the history of our organization came out the second generation of immigrant communities who were kind of fighting for a new voice. There had been much tension in the 70s and 80s with uprisings in a lot of the cities, be that Toxteth, Handsworth, but also in Radford, Hyson Green, and of course in London. And so art and culture became the broker and space to create that exchange. And it became an environment for people to meet, to learn, understand culture, and most importantly, to grow and invent new ideas, new art forms, and also to share some of the kind of traditions and cultural practices of those communities. So the space that came out of all this was New Art Exchange. And it is what it says on the tin. It exchanges art in new ways. It delivers a 24/7 program that's very much focused on diversity, and a special focus on contemporary visual culture. But it also expands into a multitude of different art forms, providing a space for public programs, be that film, be that seminars, talks, and we also deliver several festivals. And we continue to deliver Nottingham Arts Mela now, which is also online and available, nottinghamartsmela.org, so go and check it out, it's all at the moment. And we also deliver another festival called Melting Pot, which looks at the culture of food and culture within the area. And I think today's challenge of misinformation, fake facts, not being overly controlled by AI and social media and media beyond, these systems that have conditioned, in a sense, communities. I think one of the key things for us, that challenge, is providing a space that questions, asks new ways of thinking about the world we're in, identifying new reasons for being, and seeing that the issues of inequality are tackled in a way that provide solutions that, invent solution, therefore. So New Art Exchange, it's based in High Street Green. It's into its 11th year, 12th year, and we're looking forward to the next decade. It is a challenging time, and at the moment we're closed. We reopen in October 2019 with a show by a brilliant artist called Phoebe Boswell. And Phoebe's work looks at the issues of gender, politics, and the politics of being Black in the kind of 21st century. So when we do open, I hope to see you all there. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you, Skinder. Loads in that, and I've got loads of questions. Largely my first one, I think that what you need to bear in mind will be asking you about your programs for a culturally specific organisation, whereas some of the other speakers don't necessarily work within that framework. So if we go on to Sharon Watson now, please.
Hello, everyone, and just extending my thanks also for being here today, for the invitation. Truly appreciated, and of course the subject matter with regards to diversity in programming is really quite a significant moment. So I'm Sharon Watson. I'm sitting here in my office here at the Northern School of Contemporary Dance as the Chief Exec and the Principal of the Northern School of Contemporary Dance in Leeds. I think I'm probably 10 weeks into my post here. Prior to that, I was 11 years as the Artistic Director of Phoenix Dance Theatre, also here in Leeds. However, that company, as the school is, locally known, nationally recognised and internationally acclaimed organisation for both the Northern School and for Phoenix Dance Theatre. My history, it's not quite as, it's very varied in terms of the work that I've done. In fact, the school that I attended was in the heart of Hales and Chapeltown, which was primarily very multicultural, but obviously it had a lot of Black students going to the school. So I've grown up with the culture around me for many, many years. Attended professional training, and to cut a long story short, I've come out the other side as a professional dancer and worked in the industry. I've spent many years working in different areas of dance, so I sit here with this particular hat on, but actually the work that I do does extend in terms of other areas of work that I tap into. And if you come across my CV, what it will say is that I'm an advocate for supporting voices of women and Black ethnic minority artists. And for me, there's something very important about putting that as a statement, because over the years, I think the work of Black and brown people have become more and more invisible. And it's become more and more challenging, and in ways which, when I create my work, I'm having to still defend what it is and how it's presented and where it's presented and how the conversations are and the lenses for which we see. And I think, Paul, that you've made the introduction around the areas of work we're going to talk about. But sometimes I find that I'm having to use to find new tools to deal with old problems. And I think through this discussion here, I'm hoping that that will help to open up the thinking around what it is that we might want to change, what we need to change, and what helps us to kind of bring a level playing field, a level performance to the playing field. Because I think as we've hit COVID and we've hit Black Lives Matter, All of these things, I wouldn't even say that they're distractions. I think they're just layered and weighted in terms of the way in which we are actually moving forward and navigating. So the problem of actually lack of visibility, engagement, support, etc., has always been there. But I do feel that within the work that we're doing, we're just trying to navigate small, bit by bit, but it doesn't always result in the mega results that we're looking for. I'm excited about the future. I really am. I think we're at a point of change right now, and it's essential that conversations like what we're about to engage in will enable us to really think about new tools for new problems. And actually the visibility of who we are it becomes really paramount, and our actions become even more so. That's kind of in a nutshell, a very, very whistle-stop tour of what I do. I work here with the students. There's approximately 250 of us when we get them all back into the building. And for me, it's important that they understand what this narrative is all about, what diversity and inclusion is all about, what visibility is all about. So very early days in terms of the conversations and the education, but I do know and I understand that it's essential. If we're going to change anything, we have to start with those that are actually young, youthful, educated, and actually ready for change.
Thank you, Sharon. Should we motor straight on to Stella?
Can I just double check that you can hear me? I've got really unstable internet at the moment. You can hear me? Fantastic. And yeah, really delighted to be here. So I'm going to go straight in and do some context so we can get into the conversation. So at the moment, I'm currently the Executive Director of London International Festival of Theatre, LIFT, which next year will see it in its 40th year of having delivered to London and to the UK international works by international artists of all kinds of scales, but actually an organisation that has a really strong heritage and history in terms of looking within a global context. And within that context, there's the ability for us to think about diversity and programming and how they kind of sit together and what other things they sit around. Still uniquely though, that conversation around internationalism and how that influences diversity and programming still needs to sharpen. And so what we're finding at the moment is that we're looking at how do we incorporate much more of a sharper focus on diversity, and not just who is on stage, but the whole thing. Who is programming? What are the programming issues? Are we programming work from the global south that is really focused on trauma? What is the problem with that? How do we incorporate diversity that is about celebration, that is about issues, that is about what is happening socially, but isn't just kind of through one-dimensional lens? So I've been at LIFT at the moment for a year. Previous to that, I was executive producer at Oval House Theatre, which again, another organisation that has a reputation and a lineage of focusing on diversity in terms of programming. And during my tenure there, we made huge changes around what diversity programming means, particularly ethnically, and what that means in terms of who are the gatekeepers and who's making those decisions, those programming decisions, and what actually are those programming decisions. And how that reflects in the team's ability to kind of tap into the decision making, etc., etc., etc. And so kind of in the recent years, my role around programming has been really solid, but actually my background over the last 28 years has been crisscrossing not just culture and arts and theatre, dance, music, the charitable sector, but also around urban development, which again is for me the crisscross place of when you're talking about diverse programming, we're not just talking about artists, we're also talking about audiences, that community context that Sharon has kind of referred to, and then Skinder also talking about the kind of longevity about how you make shifts and changes in the choices that people make around us in terms of their strategic position around culture. So I would say that a lot of the influence that I've had around being in kind of local government environments, city government environments, working internationally in other areas influences some of that programming matrix for me. So, and I do think that, you know, the place that we're in at the moment, looking at culture in terms of recovery, and what does it mean? What does a post-COVID environment look like in terms of what is on stage? What place does culture hold now? Makes me feel that this conversation is a really important one. because it could be the nucleus of the new beginning and the jumpstart culture as a whole. And so what I bring to the table, what I bring to the conversation is this crisscrossing of interdisciplinary sectorial conversation, but also the nuts and bolts of, you know, international touring, national tours. I'm also chair of Eclipse Theatre, which at the moment is holding that space of being the national Black touring company. And so, again, thinking about recovery and thinking about what is the role of diversity in programming in this new post-pandemic environment. What does that mean for Black work in particular, and ethnic work in particular? So I'm really interested in all of those kind of interplays. So yeah, really, really happy to be here and really can't wait to get started.
Thank you. So let's start the conversation by following on from some of the things that Stella's just talked about, and talking about being in that space in terms of post-COVID, but recognising in terms of internationalism that we've also got to navigate Brexit, and also that we've got Windrush, and we've also got the awareness that has happened because of Black Lives Matter. How do you program with diversity in mind so that it is positive, given all of those layers that you've got to navigate in venues that are not just culturally specific, but the host community, where it's probably 90% white and 10% diversity of everything? How do we change the picture? And I'm just who's gonna answer that one? I'm just gonna throw, actually, Skinder, you're looking quite thoughtful there. Should I throw that open to you to start the discussion?
You can. Yeah, I mean, for our scenario, we're designed to do this 24/7, so it doesn't become an issue in that sense. But like, what do you do? How do you do it? But what does come into play is the kind of the crisscross is a nice word that Stella used. The crisscross of cultures and the intersectionality of diversity. So, for example, the issue around gender, disability, sexuality can come into play, but also the kind of the intercultural dialogues that happen between multiple identity. So in Hyson Green, we have the highest proportion of dual heritage outside of London. Why is this? Well, maybe there's a lot of love in the neighbourhood. Well, that's a good start. But the thing is, how do you then present that in an artistic way that then picks up on some of the kind of challenges and issues? And yes, we can explore some of the issues which are dark and challenging through art and culture, for sure. But I think also, somebody mentioned, I think Stella, was you, or Sharon, you said something about celebration. It's very important to celebrate as much as it is to reflect upon what is happening within the world we're in order to create that kind of connectivity. So when we're thinking about programming, it's contextualizing in such a way. Now, we do take some of our work into different spaces across the country, where some of the spaces are, as you said, 90% white, and the demographic is such. York is a good example of that. So how do you take a program that's going to connect in those spaces without it becoming received as a stereotypical sort of perspective, or an impression that then, or creates impressions and responses that then stereotype the subject matter? So this is where that kind of negotiation of it and expertise is very important. So the representation of who programs becomes really important in those spaces. So the association with cultures that have expertise, whether it's coming from the community or whether it's coming from arts professionals. So these are some of the challenges that we face when we go into a multitude of different spaces. And I think the other thing is to say, well, you don't just program something once a year, you know. So there is an issue that, okay, we've done the Black artist. We're not going to do a Black artist next season. So, you know, these kind of challenges we do come across, and we do hear certain touring venues saying this to us. And so that does become an issue that one has to mark. But from our point of view, you know, in New Art Exchange, it's really about understanding how do you represent such a multitude of different voices in this complex age of a global south within a local neighborhood. And I think it really does depend upon the team that's within the organization and the expertise that they draw out from the community and from within their own life and lived experience.
Sharon?
Thank you, Paula. I think just to add to what Skinder saying there, there's a really clear example for me around how we engage with, as you said, the sort of vast range and the changes in demographic and location, etc., and venues. I think it's really interesting when we talk about diversity and understanding that within programming, that actually what do they not understand about diversity? Try to understand that area where there is a gap of knowledge, to be able to kind of question where there is a real sense that there's definitely a danger of just repeating and doing what they've always done. And for me, there's something, it sits in the system. And until we try and unpick the system, which, you know, is one job for, it's a massive job, because as far as I understand, we've been trying to do diversity for years. And we keep coming back to the same kind of, well, it needs to be leadership, it needs to be training, it needs to be inclusion, it needs to be funding, it needs to be sharing and evaluating, and then there's a working together. All of these titles that we've sat under for years and years and years, and yet we're only just penetrating the very surface of what I think change needs to be. I just want to share an example with you. So as the production that I created, Windrush, was touring and had a great success in 2018. And I had a conversation with a particular venue, and in fact there was two opposite sides of the story. Now the company that I directed are going to be 40 next year, so there's a celebration to be had there. But the company is an established organisation, award-winning, it's got everything it needs, and actually I don't consider myself an amateur in terms of my business, so I'm stepping forward into this space. What I found was that there was a rural venue that actually said, well, we're not going to get black and brown people into the venue. And having that conversation with them was interesting, because they said, but that's okay, because that's not what we want. We know who our demographic and our audiences are, but it's about their education. So how can we communicate with you? How can you help us to actually educate those that actually don't know about the story? Because it's not one-sided. The job to be done isn't one-sided. And yet the other side of that was that a very well-known venue, very popular, we visit that every year, but this year they decided they didn't want this particular production because it was so culturally diverse, but didn't kind of consider that their audience would have benefited from having that in the space. So you've got chalk and cheese, and I think to some degree, before we even get around to thinking about what we're putting in that space, with each of the venues, with each of those that are actually in positions of power and gatekeepers, that I would really want to interrogate their knowledge and understanding of how they're actually looking to engage sincerely with diversity and diverse programming.
So we've got an issue about the whole notion of decolonisation in terms of the issues that are there, and so it's about the thinking and the narrow focus and the thinking within the education. So how would we, there's Stella, she's moved across the screen there. So how would we look at the notion of what does decolonisation mean within an arts context? How would we manage that, Stella?
I think what's key is the idea of language and what that constitutes. You know, the previous question had me thinking, okay, but what do we mean when we're talking about diversity? And how does, you know, the what's happened with Black Lives Matters and the way that the cultural sector has kind of tried to absorb it, when we're now talking about diversity, we're also somehow saying anti-racist. And so when we're talking about decolonisation, a lot of, you know, there are lots of components to decolonisation. And if you think about this concept of, most of us are working within really old structures, you know, old structures of our funders. So our funders have been, you know, delivering and giving out money in this context for a long time. And that kind of where we're actually getting our investment and our money, you know, we're not businesses that are making our own money and making all of our own income, although there are many of us that do. But the real structure that we sit in is a structure where our funders are going, right, we want to see this particular change in that particular place. We're going to give you some money to do that. We've created now this environment where we are delivering government-based social priorities That is a given now of what we do. And previously that was not the case. So we're in this kind of system where colonization has lots of different components to it. It finds its place in programming, but actually it's all part and parcel, as Sharon says, the bigger structure. So we now have an environment where, whether we're programming locally in a community context, it is already colonialized. Because are we coming in and giving people the mission? Are we coming in and going, well, in order for you to really have culture, we've got the culture that you really need. And our funders have told us that that's what we're there to deliver. And we've got evaluators on the ready waiting to prove how we're doing it. So even within that context of the community engagement and the way that we deal directly with individuals, that's already kind of set. And decolonization, when we look at how it's happening in other sectors, starts from a different place. And I would say that we need to start from a slightly different place. Yes, it's about the knowledge, but we've already got structures that are up and running. When we're in a workshop situation, a workshop participation, you think about the way that creative learning works, you know, and it's an element of programming. It also has that colonization to it. We are the experts, and we go into communities without even taking and understanding and identifying the expertise that already exists within that community. We go in that same way, in that real colonized way, with an imperialist manner about us. And until we undo some of those things, it's going to be really difficult for us to get to the knowledge, because the knowledge then just changes hands. It becomes a nuanced exercise around language, but who is the custodian of this? How does that break down the systemic challenge that decolonization gives us? So for me, it's much more of a nuanced conversation, and it's much more of a deconstruction of something, rather than we've now got to add something to a curriculum or to creative learning or to education, the way we deliver. There is something inherently in need of decolonizing in the way that we work in our organizations, in the way that we relate to funders, in the way that we allow funders to give us the work that we do, in the way that we work with our teams, in the way that we incorporate diversity. All of that needs decolonizing, in my opinion. That was a bit chunky, sorry.
It was great.
Yeah.
The thing is then.
Well, just like
Skinder.
No, I was just saying that's a great manifesto for change, Stella. I mean, there's so many components in that, what you just said. And I just think the whole decolonizing agenda is really about unpicking these kind of rules and behaviors. And, you know, we're trained to think in a particular way, to play the game in a sense. You don't play by the rules, you're not in the game in a sense. Having said that, I think it's about, yes, understanding the rules and shifting them and changing them once given the opportunity. And I think it's that kind of synchronizing of that kind of disruptive tension between what happens on the root within a community and what is available within the kind of powers of changing policy and decision. So it's the kind of synchronicity, as you could argue, between grassroots and the top layer. And of course, the middle ground are those that negotiate and keep the status quo at play, often sort of deflecting the grassroots uprisal and the kind of demands of hierarchies above. So I think when we talk about these rules and shifting these rules of engagement, I think the language absolutely needs to shift. The mindset needs to shift in order for this structural change to take place. So for example, the textbooks that we look at when we look at business development are often drawn from American text, from Harvard, say, Harvard Business School. And there's nothing wrong with that because there's some good stuff in that. But I also think there's cultural nuances that come from different communities in terms of how things are done. Not everything is a linear process, for example. Yes, we plan, you know, we test, pilot, evaluate, refine, and then define. Of course, that makes sense. But I think when we're talking about sort of cultural habits and behaviors, not everybody fits into that kind of similar kind of standard in a sense. Now, to run organizations, there is a need for a standard, a need for a value system, a need for a vision that we all subscribe to, for sure. But I think it's about negotiating and bringing in those kind of different angles at play. So at least that is, there's room for that maneuver to take place within organizations. And I think the hierarchies of existing systems within our organizations and institutions continue to suppress inventive models, inventive ways of rethinking. And that is partly what this colonial or colonized state of play we've inherited. So to try to deconstruct that is a complex process, but it is about providing that kind of Pareto 80-20 rule where you're allowing inventive kind of ways of disrupting the synchronicities that actually are not at play. So it's finding those synchronicities through the disruptive systems between top and bottom and ensuring that the middle ground is part of the process as well, and not the stumbling block that keeps the status quo in place.
Sharon, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes. I think what is interesting when we talk about language, it's a really, that for me, again, is something that really does need unpicking. I think for far too long, the shift of balance has been that we have perhaps been spoken to in a way that doesn't make us proud of our history. That the stories that we're telling are not the stories that, as you said, Skinder, earlier on, about the celebrations of who we are as black and brown people. And somewhere along the line, unless we start to change that narrative, then we will only be expected to ever deliver a certain particular type of work. And that sits within a particular language, because I think that goes across government, central government, in terms of the way in which money is kind of deployed to organizations for what purpose. So the minority, the whole thing around minority as well, when you think about it, we are the global majority. And if we started to talk with a different kind of impact around who we are and how we operate, maybe there's some kind of, what's the word, that the leverage that would bring. And I look at our communities very often and feel that they are given crumbs from the table because they have to take whatever's accepted, and it kind of sits in the corner. When actually what we're trying to say to our communities is that we can't do this without you. The value of what you bring to any kind of development, creatively or otherwise, is important. It's important for us as human beings to understand that we are bigger than one individual, but our voices have to be part of that mix, have to be part of that conversation. So when we talk about language, our language actually comes from those that make the boxes for us to sit in. And if we change those boxes, if we change those that think, actually, this is not of value, or we can manage to keep the lid on this particular kind of activity, this type of culture, then we're still in control. Actually, we're often used as to be described as a risk in terms of the black and brown work. And it's like, what's risky about us? What is risky about the work that we do? Why are we the risk? When actually the audiences are there, the work is there. There's a real whole form of education that isn't being addressed right now, because it exposes the lack of knowledge and the lack of willingness to change. And that, pushing that into the forefront, if we're, again, it's that thing about using old tools to try and fix new problems, but we have to find what those tools are. And some of that is telling the truth about systemic racism within the sectors, within the structures that are saying, you're not valued only for this little bit, we can optimistically give you X, and that's how we manage to move forward. That is not the platform that I want to be on anymore. The language has to change. We are a contribution to the British culture, to British history. And I'm not saying that everybody agrees with the way that we can kind of use that, and the word isn't patriotic way of working it, but I'm born British, and I should be able to stand up and say I'm proud of what it is. But actually, where's my space at the table? How do I begin to inform and influence and educate and change the narrative so that we all have an equal take of the education of our cultures? So the language for me is really massive, and I'd love to think that somewhere along the line, we can be honest about it and be fearless about how we step forward into that space, because we've operated in that very fearful space for such a long time. By even having this opportunity to say that I don't want to be told I'm a minority anymore, even to say that in this space is really important, but the confidence to do so, and for others perhaps who are unable to be in this space, that's the kind of conversation and dialogue where we just want to have openly and honestly and say, let's kind of figure out how we do this, but don't patronize me anymore, don't put me in a box anymore, don't give me these labels, let us help you make this our identity and our cultural contribution part of who you are, because we are. And so the language for me is really significant.
So Sharon, you've started the campaign of what does that diversity look like. So you've started saying what it looks like in the future. So we've got a level playing field now, and we're reinventing it the way we think it should be. And you've started some of that rhetoric in terms of the change of language, positioning, how people are perceived, their history, their heritage, but also claiming Britishness, claiming that, for the vast majority of us, we were born here, and we're claiming our Britishness within that framework. So saying that, Stella, what does diversity look like then? What does this new diversity look like? Sharon started laying some of the template. You started the wording on the manifesto. What does it look like?
Well, for the final stage of the revolution. No. 10-point plan number 7. For me, it goes back to what Skinder was saying really early on, which is, we're now in this environment where the political structures and the political framework allows for the intersectionality of all of us. And, there is no way that we can have a conversation that is about ethnic diversity without being able to talk about how that intersects and how that makes us the stories that we tell, which links to what we want to program. We want to program stories that relate, stories that are going to resonate with audiences. We want to be able to connect with themes that are going to allow the people that are investing in our work to understand that their money is going to make a change. And so that intersectional conversation is really, really important. And it's a new term, but it's an old thing. In the days of political blackness, we were able to have those conversations, partly courtesy of Angela Davis and her book on race, class and sexuality, and all of those activists who always pointed to the existence of a kind of ethnicity that was crisscrossing lots of other things, whether that was disabilities, whether that was class, whether that was sexuality, all sorts of things. And so I think to be able to return back to that conversation, but in a different way, for me, diversity is less about the gaze of white audiences, the gaze of white programmers, and more about in the 30, 40 years that we have been servicing diversity, what have we lost and what do we need to gain? I'm in lots of space and creating lots of spaces at the moment where the conversation around diversity in organizations, in programming, in our language is being met with my Asian siblings. And to me, that's really important because we have not had the opportunity to be in the same space and to talk about the things that are important to us. What does that do to our level of storytelling? What does that do to the stories that we're able to tell and be proud of? What does that do in a combined way about the generations that at the moment we're only looking at the Windrush generation in terms of the government's hostile environment? But them stories, those people and what they bring and what we are standing on, where are those stories? And we're not talking about, repackaging the American style, storybook style for a British audience. We're talking about the themes that are recurring socially, that are recurring around hostile environments of living, the need for resilience within the cultural sector that is demonstrated in a generation that we only talk about in this activist term. So for me, I'm really interested in that diversity is broadened in terms of its gaze, that it isn't just about ticking boxes. It isn't just about, enabling white audiences to understand. It is about the need for self-knowledge and self-understanding, because, we've all got the job of unlearning to do that is greater than, it's greater than an artistic endeavor, but it's an artistic endeavor that's going to get us there, because that's what we do. We say at Lift often, that what culture enables us to do is to tell the really important, urgent stories. And in telling those stories, we are also challenging ourselves in the perception that we see in the world. That's the nature of programming. We find all these different ways to sell it to different types of investors and to artists, and that's what we're really looking at. So for me, diversity in programming is a full gambit of
all of those potential possibilities. And when we think about diversity in the future, it has to include gazes that are beyond just white gazes, that are about, then we move away from stories that are, like I said, that are all about the trauma and what it means to be black. And I want to talk about the cancer journey, if that's all right. How am I going to do that in an environment that doesn't, that only allows, as Sharon was saying, for there to be these kind of small pots and small labels. So for me, diversity is the intersectionality, it's intergenerational, and it's about looking to the future. What is the innovation in storytelling that we can bring?
Yeah, I also think within that there is still the issue of gender is still a big one, because I feel that going back to the point that Sharon raised earlier, the positioning of black women, in society, it's still at the bottom of the pile. So again, a story, a vision, a lens, a view, a perspective is really, really important. So given that we want to look at the gaze and how you change that and how you build on that for programming, how do we deal with the structures and the organizations and the history that we're navigating in terms of the arts infrastructure that's been here in that? The gaze is not the gaze that you've just described, Stella. So how do we program with diversity in mind when we've got so much to knock down? How do we do that? How do we grow a new gaze that's more reflective of the society that we would like to be in?
For me, I think that is where executive directors come into play, because it isn't an artistic question, it's an action question. And so when we're looking at as an organisation the development of our business plans, and we're looking at how we're actioning the work that we're going to do, that's where it needs to sit. It needs to become actionable. So, for example, one of the things that we've done at LIFT in the last 12 months is we've said, okay, we definitely want to program more work from the Global South. Then that has to find its way into our action plan. And so our action plan now says we are prioritising these 3 continents over the next 3 years. And that's how we're going to allow our internationalism to grow, to move away from being kind of European focused and a commitment to the Global South. And that only comes when you start to think about it just away from it just being an artistic decision. It's an organisational decision. And so for me, that's where those conversations around investment and risk and all of those things take place in a different realm away from the artistic often. And it's about boards, it's about the EDs being involved in those artistic conversations and stretching ourselves to allow ourselves to actually action it and put it within our business plans, to put it in the work.
Skinder.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. What does diversity look like? It's like, what does success look like, as the business books often get us to think about? Well, if I think about what's been said here by both Sharon and Stella, Sharon talks about truth. Stella talks about the story. And I guess the subjective truth is the story, in a sense. So who tells the story, and then who receives it, and on what terms? And I think if we were to look at a successful venture in this area, I would say it is almost a random abstraction of a complex imagination that surprises us, offers awe, insight, experiences that recharge our life, and recharge our life in a way that transforms and transcends then the meaning of art and culture through a new lens, through a series of different refracting prisms of ideas, knowledge that's been missing for all these decades. We see flurries of it for sure. The work that, you mentioned Eclipse Theatre. Organizations like Ace Dance, for example, draw those ideas to play. The artists that we work with, John Akamfra, or the curation of Echoation with Africa State of Mind, which looks at the lens of a young global South coming out of Africa. No longer the gaze of a photographer who comes from a middle class, white, privileged background, coming into Africa to design a particular perspective. So this whole thing about success within diversity then has to be about unlocking the subjective truths that create that awe and new knowledge. Paulette, you're on mute.
Thank you. I think it's time to start looking at taking questions from the floor, and I think there's a nice question that helps to round off this section, which is to each of you in terms of looking back at your careers. What would legacy look like for you guys? What would that look like? Should we start with Stella, then Sharon, then Skinder, and then I'll look to some more questions from the floor.
I don't know, it's a funny old word, isn't it, legacy? Because like it speaks to end of life. It speaks to the long, long journey and what I leave in stone. No, I'm not about that. So what I'm more interested in is the ongoing baton. What is it that we pass on? And what do we pass on while we are here? And some of that is around, for me, is about the knowledge and understanding of how beautiful diversity is, how beautiful, for me, coming as somebody who has an Anglo-Nigerian background, you know, part of the legacy that I want to leave is a real pride in the beautifulness that it means to live a Black life, and even more so to be a Black artist and how beautiful that is. I'm really interested in, you know, one of the things that really influenced me when I was coming up was being surrounded in the late 80s, early 90s with loads of Black and Asian companies. And really, really, you know, when I came to maturity, I looked around and they were all gone. And it was like, what? And at one point there were 37, can you believe that? 37 Black and Asian cultural companies existing all at the same time, and they just disappeared over a long period of time. And so for me, you know, I'm really a creative person. I'm really a person who could as much be an artistic director as I could be executive director, but made the decision to learn and understand what it means to keep something sustainable. What does it mean to make something sustainable? Because, you know, the game that diversity in programming also points to is that we are always brought on to create. And we will always create. Creativity will take care of itself. But if we have a whole, particularly ethnically, if we have a whole generation, again, that is only focused on the creativity, it will just disappear because it won't be in our hands. So for me, part of my legacy as one of the only top, out of the top 50 MPOs in the UK, I am the only Black ED. I want to increase that and to really encourage some people to think about how, you know, it's not boring being on the business side of things, but that is where the innovation is. That's where the sustainability of the creativity comes from. Because some of us have been around and have seen it, the creativity go to the heights and then fall, go to the heights and then fall. And at the moment, for me in theatre, I currently see theatre is really in the heights. But I've been around and seen the falls. So I'm like, right, we've got to have some people that are focused on these other elements. So I'm really interested in that being part of the legacy, to encourage the 21st century leader to be both artistic and to be both business minded, so that we've got sustainability for hundreds of years and not just from decade to decade.
Thank you. Was it Skinder or was it Sharon?
I think it might have been me, Pawlet. You know, I'm kind of almost not ready to look back at my career, because I think looking forward, there's so much yet to be done. And as that was what Stella has just said around, you know, the things that are ongoing, you're kind of doing them without really realizing that they're already building your legacy, that they happen to have they're having an imprint. And for me, there is something to be said about impact. And every day that I think, or every incarnation of me as an artist, as a director, as a leader, as a mom, as a Black woman, as all of these things that are important to me, that there's something impactful about my purpose for being here. And right now, at the moment, I think change is important. That is part of my legacy. Change is part of who I am. Change is part of what I do on a day-to-day basis. And that becomes a real significant driver. So to be able to see myself, you know, in another 10 years from now, because we've all been well, I'm not going anywhere. There's too much work to be done. But actually, as I move forward, that we actually find the footprints, that if I can make them deep enough and actually allow others to step into them, then I know I'm making a legacy. I know I'm building a legacy. So, you know, I'm not, you know, to analyze that right now feels a little bit premature for me. Other people can tell me about the things that have been impactful, which I'm sure will sustain itself in some shape or form. But the idea that actually, you know, change is inevitable, and to kind of feel that I'm part of that journey, to feel that I'm part of actually, even if indeed it's not your name that's signed to it, but you're impacting, you're influencing, you're supporting, you're guiding, you're doing all the things that you know, actually in your younger days, had someone driven you in the same way, you'd be in a very different place now. Or, you know, you'd have much more of an impact and much more knowledgeable person. All of those things for me is actually, someone will tell me about my legacy at some point. And I just hope that I continue to be able to, as I say, as I reinvent the different roles in which I connect to and work within, that I am making something happen for someone, so that my time is valued in a way that I think is impacting the change that is yet to come.
Skinder?
Yeah, I think the idea of legacy is that it's alive, and it's as if we're remembering the future by saying it. The future hasn't happened, but in certain cultures it already happened, and we're moving towards the end of time. And so when we think of it from the point of view of trying to create a future scope or future scape of some sort, just looking behind me, there's a sunset happening. You know, vital for our life is the sun. It sets and it re-emerges. But when it re-emerges, what new life forms, therefore? And I think what both Sharon and Stella are saying is absolutely vital. The pipeline coming through, the structures, the models, the systems within which we work need to be multifaceted, fluid, constantly shifting and shape-shifting, like an incredible vehicle on a rocky terrain. This is the state of play. The terrain is constantly shifting. So it's having the ability to have a sector, and a diverse sector, that is, that can respond and shift and make that change in order for us to revitalize and share the stories that we've not heard. But the pipeline and the new generation is the next decade. So at New Art Exchange, for example, I think for us, we've built a foundation over the last decade. So building foundation within legacy strategies is really, really critical. So what does that mean? So having a strong resource base, having a strong asset base in terms of skills, in terms of people, in terms of networks, in terms of local to international spectrums and continuums, all of that needs to be in place. And critical in the next phase of our life for the next decade is to now use that foundation in order to activate new generational thinking. Somebody mentioned, I think, 21st century leadership. Well, let's step it into 22nd century leadership then. Let's shape shift to another principles into the reality of a strong foundation, into the actuality of really creating an exciting, vibrant, representative space that deals with the urgency, but also creates that modernity and awe that I think art gives and brings to our lives.
Thank you. For me, one of the things about legacy, it's linked with archive, and an archive is supposed to be living, not dead. An archive equals dead, and realistically, we need to make archives live, accessible, and we also need to punctuate archives so they reflect the true cultural landscape of the UK, and that's the issue when we look at some of the things about legacy. Everyone thinks they're reinventing and everyone thinks they're coming new to the table, and actually it's already been done before. Let me just go to another question that we had, and the question we had was what is the accountable pace of change that you are each working to, and what ways are you resourcing experimentation and change? Anybody?
Can I, do you mind if I go?
Yeah.
So I feel like I'm working to two different time frames. So there's the work that I do in my day-to-day job that is, it's both cyclical. It could be 3, 5, 10-year visions that you're trying to kind of enact, and that has a particular pace to it. But some of the work that I've kind of engaged myself and made happen myself, whether that's Black Women in Theatre, whether that's the work around the All of Us campaign around redundancies and safeguarding Black, Asian and ethnically diverse workforce in this current COVID period, whether that's about the We Are Visible campaign, which was about really recognising that there is a huge amount of Black women who have had 30, 40, 50 years in the game alongside these young, dynamic, up-and-coming women. So the We Are Visible campaign was really short. So I'm really also into these pop-up moments where the activism that is needed to sit underneath the long-term planning is about instantaneous stuff. So in roughly about 4 weeks, we went from having a conversation about redundancies and how it was going to impact people to developing the program, having the GoFundMe online, having those really strategic conversations, building the program, getting the cultural sector behind it within 4 weeks. And so I'm really interested in a pace of change that is about the quick wins, because there are some quick wins, but I also recognise that there is this long-term gain, and that is both sectorial and organisational, but it also recognises that in order for some of us to sit and talk eloquently about our experience as ethnically diverse people, we have had to learn and unlearn and read and talk and get into debates and live some lives that we don't even remember in order for us to be in this position today. So that work that is required now in this kind of moment of anti-racist action and action planning that people are doing, we recognise that that is a long game. So I'm really interested in the long term and which are the things that we are handing on to other people to kind of take on. I'm interested in the learning that I get from the people that I'm kind of surrounding myself with. And I'm also interested in these pop-up activities that are about instantly demystifying things, about recognising the pace of change that is needed. I can't wait around for the learning that I know needs to happen. So I'm changing the gaze. So I'm doing lots of things that's about our internal gaze and how we look at ourselves, and not about how do we bring everyone else along. And yet I've found other places for the collective, let's bring everyone along. And that's more long term. But the short term is we've got to know how big and bad and beautiful and badass we are. And we've got to continue to hold ourselves and sustain the work and the creativity that we develop. We've got to recognise the skills and the intergenerational divide that is being attempted to, create this divide between the generations, whether that's baby boomers, Generation X, Generation Y. That is an active divide and rule structure that we know. So we're trying to work against that. So for me, the pace of change is several. And I work at those in different contexts, and I do more of the fun stuff outside my job.
Skinder.
That's a really interesting idea, the fun stuff outside of the job. I mean, also the question is such a bombastic question around accountability and pace of change. And then experimentation that you in order to pace and change. For me, it's about action at fast pace for sure. But danger of that is, of course, you can create sort of broken framework. So having frameworks for failure are also part of this. Intention is that you're bound not to create something that's long lasting. So being open to that is really important. But making time and having resources for that is really important. In terms of accountability, I think I agree with what Stella was saying there. I mean, the time, the folding of time here is very interesting, because you've got the instant moment that you're dealing with. And often the work we're doing is the kind of urgent chaos that surrounds our communities. That's your core program in a sense. And then you have a public program that responds to it. And a lot of experimentation comes out of that. But if you look at contemporary art spaces, they program at least, I think, 12 to 18 months ahead of time. So catching the instant moment is done with the public program that then responds to a subject matter that was designed 2 years ago, even 3 years ago. some of it remains relevant. So that kind of pace and accountability is very interesting then. So the accountability is to the public, the knowledge that you're trying to share, the audiences that expect such a vibrant offer, and then of course the artists and being accountable to them, and of course the funders and investors. All of that is at play going on. The way we work at New Art Exchange is that you have a core program, a public program that then responds, and then you have an experimental fringe that sits in the periphery of action, that sits outside the institution, works with a whole range of different networks. And the weird thing is, I'm more comfortable sitting on the periphery than within the core. So I oscillate in the outer hemisphere of our kind of celestial kind of sense of complexity in this kind of multiverse of art and culture within diverse realms of contemporary art. So this whole thing about pace is really interesting, because there are different paces at play. Some of the ground sort of revolutionary activist art is far more fast-paced than institutions. Institutions are always waking up 2 years too late, possibly a decade too late. So for us as an organization, it's making sure we don't fall into that trap, that we get so comfortable within a system and, you know, a process that becomes mundane. And there is a danger that you do that, because one, that's how the funding works, and that's how the cycle of the financial year works. But also, it's easier to manage season by season, space by space, as it's expected to be. There is seismic shifts needed in all institutions, all organizations, be that the grassroots, be that the institution that's established for 30, 40 years, or even a decade. One of our challenges going forward is to shift that pace, to ask the brutal truth, the question as to, are we really relevant? And that's the biggest question that's always on the back of my head, back of my mind, and I'm always at the forefront of my action. So in a sense, understanding then the different paces at play, because there are so many layers at play when it comes to delivering a vital and important program that's, you know, that deals with the kind of complexity of diverse, you know, systems or histories or futures in terms of race, class, gender, and the wider equality agenda.
Sharon, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I will. And as you were both speaking, Stella and Skinder, I think what's really been, I couldn't agree more with what you've both been saying. And I've just jotted down the kind of the long game and pace. And I think in terms of the activity, there's always something that kind of wraps around and that's the outer peripheral kind of activities that take place around how long is the long game, and, you know, what are the quick wins. But underneath all of that, I think all of that is really kind of, I hope I explained this well, but what I think is in the mix of all that is the job that we're doing consistently around the long game, consistently around pace. And when we look at how we're trying to frame and support the changes that need to happen and who we talk to, there is something around the confidence to be able to just, I wouldn't even say navigate one's way, but there is something, you know, you talk about the length of time it takes to make something happen. And for those that are new and kind of looking at young talent stepping into this place where we're looking at sustainability and we're looking at change and the long game, it takes time to build that confidence, because you can't do it explicitly. There is something about the weight of working behind the scenes in all of what we do. And, you know, Stella, you talk about the stuff that you do inside the job and outside. Actually, there's a lot that happens on that peripheral, and it's hard to decompartmentalize which bits you're finding is taking shape where, because in order to change something and to know that we're here in for the long game, it's about holding on to some of these values and people and activity and action that take time to get the roots going, and then to take time to nurture them and edge them to the edge of the first rim of the circle before you edge them to the second rim. And actually, we as people, when we're doing that, we also become very different accountable people. So, you know, you're holding on to that difference as well as actually hoping that who you're working with, how you're working, and how you're nurturing the change through, whether it is through political activism, whether it's through mentoring, whether it's through identifying new talent, whatever it is, there's always something. I don't know, I don't know if I've kind of wrapped myself up here a little bit, but I just feel as though behind the scenes, behind the way in which we operate as people, we are accountable to ourselves because we know we've got to make the change. We know we've got to be politically active in terms of how we engage with all of this. And so for me, there is, you know, the parallel. Actually, there's probably another layer that we're working towards, because at the end of the day, if we don't bring in the goods, we're not going to hold on to these jobs for very much longer. So that's the very practical sense of how we operate and how we answer to the kind of the activity that we make happen. But we also believe that change is part of who we are, and how we navigate that in order to successfully arrive at where we are. It's the long game, and we're doing that consistently. I'm not sure if I've quite explained what it is I'm trying to say there, but there's just something about that behind this, that liquid way of working, that actually you can't separate yourself from accountability.
So with that accountability, with that change, where there's going to be big change is the audiences. So, you know, where we've talked about the programming, we've talked about, you know, aesthetics, we've talked a little bit, we've hinted about, you know, funding, but actually what does the new audience look like? Who is the new audience? Who is the work for? And with the issue about pace and change, the thing is that one of the things about some of the new audience is the issue of pace. The world does work quicker. The new audience do like things like this. So what's this new audience? So we've got this diversity programming, and who's our audience? What does it look like?
Can I just put something in the mix there about who are the audience part of it, Paula? It's quite interesting because I think we live in a very kind of disposable world right now. We want things instantly, we want change, and we don't like this today, we don't like that. But we're also really quite responsible and also often very guilty of telling people what they should and shouldn't like. We tell people that they're not going to enjoy this, so don't go to that. And actually, for once, I would love for our audiences not to be guided in that way, but to be allowed to make their own choices around who they are and what they see and what they engage with. Because, you know, statistics, we've just had the very real experience of it's not coding. What was the GCSE system?
Oh, the A-level results.
Yes. What was the oh God, what was the system called? The binary system, and which was absolutely messed up. So yeah. we continue using these systems that tell us what we think we want to experience, and therefore we're made to back away from, well, you're not going to like that. We know coding, we know how it works. So let's forget about some of those things. Let's forget about coding, because it's only going to tell you who the programmers want to do, what they want to do with it. I actually hope to God that actually our audiences can understand that where they can go and how they can encourage their venues to program what's different about what they want to absorb, what they choose to consume. And, you know, the whole thing around disposable for me is a big problem, because some of what we create is not ready to be disposed of. It needs to travel because there's not enough people seeing enough of the work. And there's two different challenges there. But I think let's stop. Thank you, algorithm. Cheers. Let's stop telling people what they think they're going to enjoy, because you're not used to it. It's not been part of your system. They probably don't know until they've tried it. So really, a diverse audience needs to look like, for those of you that live in London, you know, the 38 bus, because that's our culture. That's who we are. And, you know, for Leeds, it's the number 12. I don't know where it is in Birmingham, in Scotland, or anywhere else, but you understand what I'm saying. And I think that's our audiences can help us also to connect. Our audiences can help us to talk better to the challenges, to the successes, to the celebrations, to the people, to the culture, to the young people, all of these areas that we should be communicating to. Let's really try not to box them in, and let's see how much broader we can give, and whether it's entertainment or whatever, let's see how much more we can bring that into the spaces.
I think also adding to that, I think if you think about art and culture, as we frame it these days, there is an argument between the two. They're not necessarily in dialogue. They're sometimes at loggerheads with one another. So art is battling with culture and culture is battling with art. But once we get the kind of interplay right, or coming back, was it Stella's word, crisscross, the crisscrossing of art and culture in a way that then sort of draws the number 38 bus, Sharon, you'd mentioned on your journeys. They're the people, and certainly like in High Street Green, I think about all the traders or the people who run the markets on Wednesday, or the parents and the school kids walking past our venue, and some of those people coming into the venue. I'd like to say everybody coming into the venue, but it's not the case, because people have complex lives. And when you're dealing with audiences, you're dealing with communities, you're dealing with people. They're not just audiences that consume art. They are people who create culture themselves in their own way. They are reinventing themselves every decade. You only have to look at New Art Exchange 10 years ago. You look at the demographic of the people then, and the people coming into the venue were different. The demographic shifted, cultures have shifted, ways of using space have shifted. So it's understanding those psychologies at play that make a space or make a program relevant. And I think about the pick and choose method is definitely one of those things. The whole digital age, we've just delivered the festival, Nottingham Arts Mellor online. There's a range of different types of work that you can consume and you can reconsume, and you can do it at your pace. All of that is important, as are the kind of algorithms at play, whether they're understanding that. And, you know, we have to, in a sense, take back our own control of those systems that are designing what people are thinking. So we are up against a world of misinformation, fake news, you know, niche communities who congregate through digital platforms. We are competing with that a lot more. So it's understanding that. So when we're thinking about designing our programs, a lot more needs to be co-curatorial, but also we need to find inventive ways of, and inventive models in terms of what art is made. And, you know, that intersection that Stella referred to earlier on, or around the program at Lift, you know, how does that play in a contemporary space, or within the dance scene, or within the theatre scene, or within literature? So now, how are those intersections then drawing different perspectives in, but going beyond the norms of art and culture? So going back to the number 38 bus then, so who are those people? What is relevant to them? How is art different from culture? How is culture different from art? How does it then create, again, the third space of invention between the binary representations that we often box things into?
Okay,
What's really interesting is I often spend a bit of time not going back like 2019, but actually thinking about this moment in time being a real change. Like everything is going to be built from now. And what's been really fascinating, I think, about COVID-19 is that every single person, every single household across the UK has become reacquainted with culture, whether that's the iPod, whether that's the music they've been listening to on Spotify, whether that's the, you know, family congregation over TV or online. You know, culture has got people through COVID-19, and that gives us huge amount of possibilities for what the future could look like in terms of audiences. And it relates to the programming and how diverse it is. And in that context of diversity, I'm talking about diversity of thought, diversity of expression, you know, and that there is this huge, I think, opportunity as we rebuild the cultural sector now, that there's this potential audience that has just stripped away all of the fanciness and has got reacquainted with the power of culture in so many different forms. And it's our job, and it should be really the thing that we do next, whether that pace of change is fast or slow or long term, to tap into that because I think that changes who the audience can be, changes what stories are told, who the storytellers are, what gets left, what the legacy is. It changes everything if we build from here rather than thinking about what it was like kind of in February or last year or in 2016. That here, this is a moment in time globally, and that then includes online audiences to reconfigure what diversity in programming could look like beyond now.
So realistically, that answered the question earlier about what does diversity look like. However, here's another question. I think this possibly might be the last question we've got time for. Someone said, the last year has seen many diverse artists and organisations respond so quickly to the impact of COVID-19 on Black Lives Matter and create fantastic work. What can we learn from their responsiveness, and is it sustainable? Anybody?
And I know that, I don't know if this is the right reference, but one of the things that has happened is the move for lots of work to go online, and that and holding that digital space. I don't know if that's kind of, I can't see the question, so I'm just trying to remember what you said, but the context
it's the fact that people responded really quickly, and it's been great work, but is it sustainable?
Well, I definitely miss the liveness and the gathering. I definitely think, okay, where is the place for large scale work? It's great seeing all these one people things in their bedrooms. It's lovely. I love it. Beautiful, nuanced, exceptional in so many cases. But where is this is a collaborative art form a lot of the time. Where are we able to see the large scale dance performances? Where are we able to congregate together where culture can have its full place? So I think it will have a legacy. I do think that even in some of the planning that I'm doing at the moment and looking over the next 3 years, I want to incorporate what we've learned that we can carry on. But I don't think it will. I don't think the speed will necessarily continue, because we'll get back into a kind of relaxedness. And I think that the pace will probably not be the same. But I think those kind of what we're learning around audience appetite, what we're learning around what we can program quickly, what we're learning about how we can collaborate quickly amongst ourselves in a crisis, who doesn't love a crisis, but that crisis is not going to persist. So I'm not sure if it's going to have a legacy, but I think some things will remain. I'm definitely taking on board some things around, artistic practice, what are the, new ways of socially engaged work, all of that kind of stuff, and what the potential that socially distancing in when we reopen will provide some legacies for some venues even. So I think there'll be some remnants of it, but I don't see it as being something that can be permanent. It can't be, because it's in a crisis.
Yeah. Anyone else? Sharon?
Yeah, no, oh, go Sharon.
Okay, I'm gonna go. Sorry, I think what's really been quite interesting over this period of time is that I think people are understanding the different forms in which culture takes, because I think it's the one thing that's really kept us going as a society, that we've engaged with culture in some shape or form across the world, whether the people singing from their bedrooms, doing exercise in their gardens. And actually what it has done as well is really pull together a local importance. And I think when we look at the value of what we've experienced and what we've learned, for those of you that heard the statement about the crown jewels, it was really disappointing to hear that, but then again, the crown jewels, the way in which the crown jewels are being held up as the one and only way of actually operating culture, and everybody needs to be part of it and see it. The local work that is happening is where the change of the dynamics are actually taking place right now. And I think where we put the value on that is going to change. And I think that is sustainable. If we look at how that's operating and how people are actually finding their neighbours, and the kind of the way in which some of the organisations are now pulling together to work, that's the strength that can be sustained. And I also miss the idea of being out and being with people. I work in an environment where it's about contact half the time, the majority of the time within the dance environment. I miss that, and I actually want to create that. But I also understand that what it has done is actually the macro way in which we've operated is something to be looked at. And as Stella mentioned, taking the good from that is what I think where we can start to really build and sustain our economy once again. but really the understanding of how people have engaged with culture, and culture across the board. You know, the drawings that you saw in the windows, some of the stuff that actually, there's a lot of stuff on the platforms, the digital platforms, and I have to say some of it is not so great, some of it was phenomenal, but actually understanding how we utilize that and how we make that better for those that perhaps would never engage in that way. So there's a lot of ways in which I think some of the work that we're doing currently can be sustained, but we have to understand where we tip balance, because it's not the highbrow kind of, you know, big crown jewels that is going to make change happen. Where we are right now with the locality and the work that we're doing with our neighbours next door, changing theatres from theatres to social spaces into other ways, those things I think have some lessons to be learned, and maybe we can hold on to some of that change.
Any final thoughts, Skinder, before I wrap up?
I think, yeah, just on that thing about this moment. I mean, yes, it has been unprecedented, and therefore, you know, life will never be the same for many people, I think, with what happened during this period. And if you think about social behaviours or behaviours of people consuming art and culture, there has been a shift, and there has now become a reliance on the digital space. And, you know, art and culture will always invent, and artists will always find a way to survive. And in this period, I'm optimistic that artists will survive. And I think the sector itself has responded brilliantly, from Arts Council to those that responded to the emergency funds, and in creating action and creating employment opportunities. But it also made us realize the vulnerability of our models at play. You know, the model of ticketed systems that rely on so much income from audiences, or trading arms of our organizations, which have completely disappeared in the space of 6 months and are now having to reinvent and restart again. I only have to think of New Art Exchange in the first year, how much money we lost. But I also know how long it took to make that business work. And now we're having to start again on that front. These are major challenges. And I think now going forward, there will be a shift in how art and culture is made. There is a thirst to be together. You can just see that in the pubs when people have gone crazy trying to reconnect. But there is a danger that this terrible disease has not finished. And, you know, we, in this period, have to be inventive. And the great thing about art and culture, it is probably the most inventive space. And in terms of just the economy, it was always the fastest growing element of our economy in the US. So it is an inventive sector, and it is a low resource. So I have optimism about it, but I do have concerns about the vulnerability that the models that we've had in the past will now have to rethink in terms of surviving and then obviously thriving. Although I hate that line.
Okay, on that note, I need to thank the three panelists for an absolutely fantastic discussion, which I think has given a lot for people to take away with them when they think about how they program. I just want to end with a couple of 4 words and tell you what I think those 4 words mean in terms of programming. Brave, which equals patience and strength. Risk, which equals opportunity. Innovation, which equals leadership. And vision, which equals the future. Thank you. Is that us done then, Alan?
Thank you very much, Pawlet. I was just popping up to say thank you to you for creating such a wonderful event. I want to thank also both Greg and David, our BSL interpreters.
Thank you.
Also to let people know that I know there was one request for it that came through in the Q&A about if this recording would be available. It definitely will. Bear with us, because putting them all up is a hard process with our limited team. But by the end of next week, it should go up, and it'll go up on the marketplace. So that's marketplace.edfringe.com. Similarly, there's been so much great discussion in the chat. People have been sharing links and comments. So if anyone would like access to that at any point, please do just drop us an email on artsindustry@edfringe.com, just so as you can have a note of the conversation. Some of the
Yes, because it would be good, because the panelists had asked us before if we could know who attended, so we just so we got a sense of who our audience was that we were talking, because we don't know who we actually don't know who we've been talking to.
Yeah, and our wonderful audience is still out there, so we've got that report, so we'll definitely be able to share that. And finally, I guess I want to do like a last plug for one of our final events on Monday morning, which is kind of on a similar theme. It's about designing an inclusive recovery, and it's working with We Shall Not Be Removed, which is a cross art form alliance that was established to raise the profile of creative, deaf, disabled and neurodiverse people through and after COVID, while advocating for a more inclusive cultural recovery. So it'd be great. It's one of our final events before we wrap up of what's been a great month-long journey.
Well, thank you guys for this, because I think I think everyone enjoyed. I enjoyed this session. So thank you ever so much, everybody. It's been really, really good. And I'll catch up with you on another Zoom or something, folks. But thank you.
I'm going to press the end button, but thanks everyone, and have a great weekend when it comes.
All right, thank you. Cheers. Bye.